face in covering stories like these in Japan. We are joined from Tokyo by James Corbett, who is the founder of FukushimaUpdate.com, and from Columbia, Missouri by Steve Starr, who is the Program Director of Clinical Laboratory Science at the University of Missouri School of Health Professions. He is also a former board member for Physicians for Social Responsibility. And gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for coming on Global Journalist today. James, I'd like to start with you. Can you just give us a little bit of background? What is the current situation like in and around the exclusion zone? Have people been able to come back at any time to see what their old houses look like, to collect any types of belongings? Can you just bring us up to date on what's going on in and around Fukushima right now?
Well, there have been more people who have been able to return for day visits to see their old homes and collect items that they need, and that has been gradually happening more and more in recent months. But I think that the one of the underplayed and underreported aspects of this crisis all around is really the social effects and the family effects on these home lives that have been completely torn apart by the disaster. And just as an example of that, back in April, there was the result of a survey that was released that showed nearly 1/2 of all of the Fukushima evacuees have been forced to split up. 1/2 of the families that were evacuated as a result of this have been forced to split up and live in separate locations for various reasons, work or school-related reasons. That's a pretty stunning figure in and of itself, and unfortunately, an even sadder figure from that survey showed that 70% of those families had members that were suffering from some form of mental illness or distress or depression, which is perhaps not surprising given the severity of this, but unfortunately it's still quite a tragedy. And that's, I think, one of the underreported aspects of this tragedy, because the only people who are really attempting to deal with this, supposedly, are TEPCO and the Japanese government, and there are huge concerns about the way they're attempting to do that, and whether it's too little, too late, and whether they're just refusing to provide compensation to some of these people altogether.
Well, from your vantage point, what has the coverage of the recovery been like in Japan? Is it something that's still been on the radar for the most part, more than 3 years afterwards, or is it something that's kind of lingering in the subconscious but not necessarily at the fore?
I would say it is still on the radar, but it is certainly further towards the periphery of that radar than it was, obviously, at the time of the disaster and in the immediate wake. And I think it's been displaced by economic concerns and some of the concerns over the remilitarization of Japan that have really moved this off of the center of the table when it comes to the political discussion here. And as a result, of that, and also as a result of, I think, the nature of the news cycle itself, we've just seen the story has been covered in all of the ways that it can be covered, and now it seems to be more in an update type of cycle, so that when there is new developments to report, they'll be reported on. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of investigative work going on at this point, especially, of course, from the mainstream media here.
Has it been difficult for the media, be it the mainstream media, or I guess as we would say now, untraditional sources of media, social media and those types, to get access either into the exclusion zone or information from TEPCO and the government itself, David? Or excuse me, James?
Yes, well, of course, access to the exclusion zone itself and the immediate vicinity of the plant has been restricted and continues to be, and is heavily monitored by the authorities, so that only approved and credentialed journalists can get in with the express permission of TEPCO, and usually on guided tours of the facilities. So I think what we have to conclude is that a lot of the reporting that comes out of those types of officially guided tours is certainly sanitized for the public consumption. And that is one of the key, I think, problems of reporting on this story, is the question of access, which is not only related to this particular issue, but also goes to the way that the Japanese journalism profession is structured, with the infamous Kisha clubs, as they're called, which is basically an organization that credentialed and accredited journalists from the mainstream major newspapers and major television outlets have access to, which gives them direct access to the government officials, But for anyone on the periphery of that, anyone who is not part of that of those clubs and not one of the mainstream official accredited reporters, they do not have access to those officials. They are not able to ask questions or get answers from the people who are directly dealing with this situation. So that is a definite a roadblock to would-be journalists from the periphery that would like to try to cover this. And now, just late last year, there was the passage of the state secrecy bill in the Japanese parliament, which is bringing in even further regulations on the potential for whistleblowers to blow the whistle on Fukushima, presumably, or any other government-related matter that will see such whistleblowers subject to 10 years imprisonment. And unfortunately, the wording of that act was so vague, simply applying to any sort of government secret, that really almost anything could conceivably fall under it, just given the way that the Japanese government deems to classify the information. So it certainly does at least present the possibility that information from Fukushima that otherwise would have gotten out from certain sources will not now get out because of people being basically afraid to try to blow the whistle at this point.
And Steve Starr, your research looks at the lingering effects of radiation on populations, on communities, both from, I guess, a health standpoint and a social standpoint. You've also looked at Chernobyl. Do you think that some of the reactions that the Japanese government and TEPCO have had to this are similar to what we saw in the aftermath of Chernobyl?
Oh, yes. I mean, there's a lot of similarities. Response has generally been orchestrated. After Chernobyl, the Soviet authorities made it illegal for physicians to diagnose radiation-related illnesses. I don't think it's quite that degree of control in Japan, but through PSR we do hear that there's a lot of people are discouraged from looking at it and reporting certain things. But I think there's a larger question there would be what happened after the accident. The radiation safety standards in Japan were similar to those in the United States in terms of exposure before the accident. But there was about 11,000 square miles of mainland Japan that were significantly contaminated with long-lived radionuclides, particularly cesium-137, and about 4,500 square miles, or roughly the area of the state of Connecticut, was contaminated enough that, according to their earlier standards, those areas would have had to have been evacuated. So what Japan did was they multiplied times 20 for their standard safety standards. So it made it acceptable to live in all these areas, except, of course, in the radioactive exclusion zone that you mentioned, which is still about a couple hundred square miles. But when you get in an area that's significantly contaminated with cesium-137, which is the predominant radionuclide that's released in these when spent fuel at nuclear power plants is melted down or ruptured. The cesium becomes a gas. It's spread by the wind and it's rained out. There's a patchy deposition. It's never uniform, but these areas that are seriously contaminated, cesium is highly water soluble. It tends to get into the soils and it biomagnifies. It moves up. It concentrates as it moves up to different levels of the food chain. It also contaminates potassium-rich plants like berries and mushrooms, and it gets into the meat and dairy products. So if you subsist on food in these areas, which a lot of Japanese have to raise their own food, they're going to be a lot more at risk. We've seen that in the contaminated areas of Belarus. So there's a lot of implications there in terms of if you live in Japan and you're in areas that are contaminated. This, of course, has been a big area of dispute in the industry and the IAEA and various physicians groups and scientists. So I want to make it clear that there's an ongoing argument about what exactly is safe. I mentioned earlier before the show that the U.S. Standards, and they're guidelines more than standards, but our FDA says we set standards that are 12 times higher for the amount of radioactive cesium in our foodstuffs than Japan does. So Japan will have foodstuffs that are too radioactive for their own markets that they will undoubtedly ship to the United States for consumption here. So there's a lot of ramifications in terms of radioactive contamination that's taken place.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Casey Morell. We are looking at recent developments in Fukushima and at some of the challenges reporters face in covering stories like these in Japan. We're joined by James Corbett, the founder of Fukushima Update, and by Steve Starr, who is the program director of clinical laboratory science at the University of Missouri School of Health Professions. I want to remind you that you can listen to this and other full episodes of Global Journalist on our website. That's globaljournalist.org. For more Global Journalist content, you can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. Now, Steve, back to what you were saying. There was a quote that you had that was written in a PSR report that came out in April of 2011, just after the Fukushima incident. And you said, and I quote, "Every time we build and operate a nuclear reactor, we do so with the implicit assumption that we shall forever be able to contain the radioactive poisons we create in the reactor. In doing so, we presume that we can predict the future for centuries and millennia to come, that we can isolate and protect nuclear reactors and nuclear waste from every single catastrophe that nature and man can inflict, including earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, asteroids, human error, terrorism, and war. History has already shown us that such assumptions are indeed both foolish and futile." Do you think that putting this power station on the coast of Japan, where it was potentially tsunami prone, was a disaster in the making, that it was something that was just already waiting to happen?
Well, yes, the design was very flawed in a lot of ways. They lowered the cliff. It was 115 feet above sea level, and they built the plant about 30 feet above sea level. There was a lot of historical records that showed that tsunamis had hit Japan that were 20 and 30 meters high. They built their seawall about 4.5 meters high to protect against it. They had their diesel generators in the basement. The water intake was at sea level, so everything got wiped out. But, I want to also point out that the U.S. has 22 reactors of the same design as the ones at Fukushima Daiichi, and most of their spent fuel pools have a lot more radioactive waste in them than those in Japan. And just an average spent fuel pool in the U.S. has roughly about 1 million grams of cesium-137 in the fuel rods. And my research shows, if you look at the exclusion map of the Chernobyl, there's about 1,000 square miles around Chernobyl that are uninhabitable too. And they define that by how much cesium-137 is in the soil. And it takes about a little more than half a gram of cesium-137 to make a square kilometer uninhabitable, or it's about 1.2 grams to make a square mile uninhabitable. And if you consider that there's 1 million grams in U.S. spent fuel pools, and there's 104 commercial reactors, and there's a lot of potential there for, even if there's no accident, if everything works perfectly, we still have to isolate this stuff from the ecosystems and the biosphere for, up to 1 million years. And I still say that there's really no viable design. I'm not sure how they can do that. I think deep underground storage is probably the best bet, but we just seen that the waste isolation pilot plant out in New Mexico was closed because they had plutonium canisters blow up in there, and contaminated radiation reach the surface. So I'm not sure. I don't think we're doing a very good job in planning ahead with this.
And James Corbett, do you think the government in Japan is doing enough for cleanup and recovery at this time, or have the people that you've talked to intimated that they feel as though they're confident in the recovery efforts so far?
Quite the contrary. I would say that, if anything, what this disaster at this moment represents is just a series of compounding errors, disaster upon disaster. And we see that in virtually everything that's applied to the site. And we have to keep in mind that, of course, what is happening at the site right now is not cleanup. They're not actually trying to mitigate the disaster itself. They're just trying to keep the effects of that disaster under control. And in order to do that, of course, they have to keep reactors 1, 2, and 3, the melted down cores of those reactors, constantly cooled by continually pumping in water, which is continually leaking down into the basements and contaminating groundwater flowing through the site, which is a huge and ongoing concern because, of course, there are just giant reservoirs of water that are being created of this contaminated water that they're attempting to store on site. But when they collect that water and put it into storage tanks that they've specially built on site for that purpose, the storage tanks themselves are leaking. Another example of this, in order to try to mitigate some of the problem with the groundwater flowing through the site, they've tried to build some bypasses to try to catch some of that groundwater before it flows through the basements and becomes contaminated.